Hi there, my name is Yasmin. I'm a tutor here at Tutor Impact, and today we are going to be learning all about fictional story writing. Now, you might not have written any stories before, or you might be writing lots, but I think this will help you in just making sure you're including the basic features to make sure your story is really interesting for the person reading it. Now, the first thing we're going to think about today is what makes a good story. Now, if you just pause the video now briefly and have a think about what a good story might include, and then we'll go on to discuss it in a few minutes. So just pause your video now and briefly have a think about what makes a good story. So hopefully now you've had a couple of minutes just to think about what you think makes a good story. Now, there's no right or wrong answer for this, but the next slide is going to show you a few of the things that I think are the most important when you're writing a story. So as you can see here, I've written structure, characters, interesting plot, the language you use, and the detail. Now, don't worry, we're going to go into each one of these in a bit of detail just to discuss how we can make each features of these as good as possible. But these are really important things that I think you should be thinking about when you're writing a story. So we'll start with the structure. Now, obviously, the structure is a good, interesting part of the story. You can't just have things going on with no sort of organization. So when you are writing a fictional story, you need to have a clear, related beginning, middle, and end. So you need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And these need to be very clearly defined, or at least structured. Within this, it's really important to have a 5-part structure. So you have the beginning, middle, and end. And across these 3 sections, you should have the 5-part structure. And the 5-part structure is the introduction, which you can see here, then the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and finally the conclusion. So what this means is if you are writing a story, there's usually something big that happens in that story to make it interesting. And what you want to do is the introduction. This is where you want to set the scene, introduce your characters, and sort of lay out the groundwork of your story. Then, as you sort of lead up to the really dramatic or exciting part of your story, you want to build up the action. So the rising action section needs to sort of build up tensions. So say your climax point, your interesting point is an argument, or it results in someone having a fight. The rising action section would set out sort of what has led up to that point. So have those people disagreed? Are they fighting over something? Is there some sort of issue that needs resolving between them? And it sort of just takes the reader through what is going on and what the dynamics are between those characters. Obviously, the climax section is quite self-explanatory. This is where everything is going to kick off. The exciting part in the story is described, and everything is very fast-paced and exciting. After that's happened, you need to sort of then slow down the pace, and discuss the aftermath of whatever has happened. And this is sort of the falling action. So this is sort of where people, if it was a fight, maybe consider apologizing, they're reflecting on their actions, and other people not involved perhaps are giving their opinions on the situation. And then you need to finish all of that up by wrapping it up and saying what the outcome is. So going back to my fighting example, perhaps they apologize, make up, and they're best friends again. Obviously, this is a very simplified version of what your story might be, but if you have that framework within your beginning, middle, and end, it means that you're in a good place, and the reader is likely to find the structure interesting and also clear, because then they can sort of follow what is going on in a nice arch before finishing your story with a resolution. So that's sort of how I would structure your story writing, and it's a really good way of sort of setting it out in the planning stages and thinking about what happens in each section rather than just trying to tackle the whole story in one go. Now, the next thing that I said is important in making a good story are the characters. So obviously these are very important aspects of a story because every story needs characters. So I would advise that you have a main character, which the story is revolving around. Sometimes the main character is called a protagonist, and obviously this is probably the most important part of the story, person in the story, sorry. You're also going to need supporting characters. Perhaps that's the main character's best friend or their family members, but you're going to need other people for that main character to interact with. It's also good to include minor characters with whom the main or supporting characters interact. So that could be just something like a shopkeeper, someone they see in the street, or even just someone else. What's important is that you must develop all of these characters. So whoever you're introducing to the reader, you need to do visual descriptions that describe their responses to the plot, and this will help the reader better visualize what is going on. So that shopkeeper, for example, although they're a minor character, what questions might you have? Could be their appearance, how do they react, how do they speak? There are so many ways you can describe and add detail to these characters. We will discuss detail later on this lesson, but from a character aspect, it's really important to develop this so that the reader just starts empathizing with these characters. Because if they empathize with these characters and they can visualize them, then it's really going to help for them to stay engaged with what they're reading, which is going to make your story much more interesting overall. So as I said, it's good to have not too many characters because it'll be hard to follow. But if you've got say 4 or 5 main characters, not main characters, sort of characters, including the main character, their supporting characters and the minor characters, then it means there's a good network of people that the reader can follow and they can follow the story and it will be interesting for them. I've sort of tried to visually describe this here in this diagram. So you've got the main character, their supporting characters, and maybe minor characters that are linked to those supporting characters. But the minor characters can be anyone. They could be related to the main character as well. So that's how I would tackle the characters in your story. And then the next thing I said that you should focus on is the interesting plot. So obviously this is quite probably self-explanatory. Obviously you would like your plot to be interesting because a reader would not want to read a story unless it's interesting in some way. So you really want the reader to care about the outcome of the story. So the more novel or the more sort of outgoing or extreme the plot is, the more likely it is that the reader is going to find that engaging and want to know the answer to the problem, to whatever's going on, to whatever they want to know what the resolution is. And you can do this by having the characters face a problem or dilemma that needs addressing. This is a very good way to keep the reader engaged, is if the characters have a situation and they need to find the resolution, find the outcome, find the solution, then that is a really good way of keeping the reader engaged because they want to know how, why, with what method that those characters manage to get out of the trouble they're in, get out of the problem they're in. And as I said, the more novel the idea, the more interesting the story will be. And I think it's really important that you sort of set out this plot and plan it before you start writing anything, because having a basic framework of the plot, which you can tie in with the structure you make, is really important. It's the basic groundwork of any story. What you can do once you've got that groundwork is then look at the detail, which is the next thing I said on the list. So I've combined sort of detail and language here. So in terms of the language, so in terms of the language, you need to have a clear voice running throughout the piece. So if you choose to write your story in first person, which is when you're saying, I did this, I thought this. You need to stick to using I rather than describing that main character in the third person. So don't change to the third person if you've been using first person throughout. So say the main character is called Cat. If the main character is called Cat, you shouldn't be swapping between saying I do this to saying Cat does this, because you need to stick to that one voice. Obviously, the supporting characters and the minor characters you describe in the third person. But if you choose to narrate the story from the main character's perspective, you need to keep it using the first person rather than then swapping to the third person. So just make sure you're sticking with that. Similarly, you need to keep the same tense. If you're describing the story in the past, so saying I did this, I did that, I then did this, you need to keep it in that past tense rather than going to the present tense, which is a common mistake I've seen, where you then put in a sentence saying I do this. So if you're saying I did, I have, all the past tense verbs, you can't then interchange this with the present tense unless you're doing that purposefully in different chapters, for example. But I personally would stick to the past tense and describe it in the past tense and stick to that, just so it's easier and you don't get confused yourself, because it's a common mistake to make where in the same paragraph people are writing in the past and the present tense. So it's just important to keep that consistent just so it doesn't get confusing for the reader. Similarly, vocabulary should be varied. Obviously, if it's very dull and not very varied, it's not going to be particularly interesting for the reader. So I'd really encourage you to use adjectives and adverbs to make your writing more engaging. Again, this sort of ties in with the character development. If you add in more words, more adjectives, you're going to build up a better picture of what is going on in your story, which is going to make it much more interesting for your reader. A final point on language would be to make sure it doesn't include any spelling errors or any grammatical errors. I've also made a video on spotting mistakes in writing, so it might be useful if you go and watch this video after you've finished this one. I go through some common grammar and spelling mistakes, and then we do some exercises in spotting these mistakes in your own writing. So I'd really recommend you watch that after this video. We're now going to do a bit more on detail. I'm just going to show you the difference this makes. So we've got two examples here, pretty much saying the same thing, but just written in different ways. So version 1, we have, I walked along the beach, the sea was blue. And the second version we have, I slowly walked along the sandy beach, the sea was sparkling blue as if it were glitter. Now you can clearly see that the second one is much more descriptive. It has a lot more verbs, has a lot more description. And personally, I find that a lot more interesting as I can find it much easier to visualize the scene. So I really think adding more adjectives, adverbs really enhances your writing, and it takes it from being a basic story to being a lot more interesting for the reader. We're now going to do another exercise, and here I want you to think about how you would describe this fish. So I want you to quickly pause the video again and have a couple of minutes and write down in as many words as you like how or what words you would use to describe this fish. So just pause your video now and I'll speak to you in a few minutes. Okay, so hopefully you've had time now to think about how you would describe this fish. I'm not going to give you loads of words because, again, there is no right or wrong answer, but I'm just going to discuss some things that I would perhaps think about. So first of all, this fish is very colourful. So first of all, I'd think about how could I describe these colours? It's bright pink / it's like a pinky orange. What could you compare that to? It's vibrant, it looks like it's glowing, maybe like a glow stick. So you can think of all these things just describing the colour. Then you could talk about the markings. Here it's got these lovely stripes that look a bit like a zebra. What else does this look like? How would you describe this? It's a striped effect. What can you talk about here? The fish might be moving. Is it moving? Is it staying stationary? How is it moving? Is it slowly gliding, or is it quickly darting away from a bigger fish? There's all these sort of avenues you can explore, especially with the movement here. The surroundings as well. We can't really see much with this one, but this gives us like the opportunity to explore this further. You could describe where the fish is. Is it in a busy multicolored coral reef? Or is it just swimming alone through a deserted shipwreck? There's a lot of scope here to discuss that further because you can't really see it, but you can go anywhere you like because it's your story. I know it's underwater, but you can also talk about the sound. So is anything audible? Is there a whoosh as it darts past? Or is there the sound of bubbles as it breathes? Again, these are other things you can just sort of discuss as you build out that picture layer upon layer. So I think that is probably all of the things you can sort of discuss from this photo. But as you can see, that is giving you a lot of scope to sort of build an image for the reader by layering up that detail. So I hope this video has been useful. I'm just going to quickly recap again these key things that I think are really important for making a story. So the structure, as we spoke about before, it's good to have the 5-part plot. So it has it building up, reaching a climax, and then resolving before concluding. The characters, we spoke about having lots of them, well, not lots, not too many, but having a network of them and making sure we were developing all of them so that the reader can build up a picture and really engage with those characters. We also spoke about having an interesting plot. So we need to make sure that something interesting happens because no one wants to read about something boring. We then spoke about the language and making sure it's accurate and making sure you're sticking to the same voice and to the same tense. And I also said that in terms of spotting mistakes, you should go and watch my video on spotting mistakes, just so you're aware of the common mistakes that people make. And finally, we've just spoken about including sufficient detail so your reader can sort of properly visualize what is going on in your story. Now, I hope this has been helpful and I hope you can incorporate this into your future story writing. Thank you so much for watching and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.